I think one of the problems with about trying to create the unintended consequences of gender equality work, I think a lot of the work on gender equality has been focused on the gender division of work, especially in the Nordic countries. And if we think with Connell, for example, if we think about power, labor, cathexis, and the symbolic as different structural components within gender, so to speak, you could see that in the Nordic gender equality work, labor has been privileged, I would say, as both the key, but perhaps also a symbol for how much gender equality we have managed to create. And I just think the Swedish example shows it's much, much more complicated than that. So that's one point about the gender equality development. I think in terms of working with women, because it's linked to this, I think the example of the kind of unintended consequences of only working with women by them being subjected to more violence shows how important it is to also work with men to address the problem simultaneously. So to actually think about also working with the men and being very safety oriented in your work. I also wanted to comment upon this thing about the different roles, which is linked to this thing about gender equality, the different roles within the household, the parent role and the spouse role. I think perhaps I wasn't clear enough in my speech that I consider it, if you use violence to your child's other parent, you are a bad parent. It's bad parenting to use violence to the child's other parent. So that disqualifies you. I mean, you need to change if you do that. You need to be very clear on that one. I also think it's important to recognize the overlap between men's violence to women and men's physical and sexual violence to children, because we know there is a connection there. However, I also think about this intersectionality perspective. I think it's also important to recognize that men's violence to children is not, when they are violent to women as well, is still not just about gender. It's also about age, power, and notions of kinship and what you can do to your blood. For example, it's also tied to these issues about what is your child and what are you a parent of, and think about parenting. Is it constructed as blood ties? Is it constructed as child-centered care work, etc.? So there are a lot of interesting issues there. I think I'll stop for now. I think there were some more questions that perhaps you want to.
I'll start with I'll start with your technology. I'll start with your three questions. You asked about, am I saying in general that there are higher rates of violence against women in countries or cultures where there's a strong notion of honour? And I think simplistically I was saying that, but it also sounds like one needs to examine exactly how honour is understood and its links to gender and ethnicity and other forms of social difference in any particular context. And it may be that there are communities or contexts where there are strong notions of honour that protect against men's violence against women. I don't know. I was going on work by Vandello and Cohen. It's not my research, and I can send you their research and you can assess it on its merits. So I agree. It's always important that we look at the sort of culturally specific ways in which violence against women may be supported or condemned in any context. And I can't claim to speak about honour cultures in general. Second, there's no doubt that there are among some groups of men, whether by age or community or some other difference, there are ideologies of masculinity that are protective against violence. Exactly as you mentioned, for example, the idea that a true man does not hit his wife. And in Australia, some people say, it's weak to hit your wife. A real man shouldn't hit his wife. But this is sometimes what they don't say is, they say a real man shouldn't hit his wife, but they also mean unless she looks at another man, unless she is unfaithful, or unless she is not a good wife. So sometimes ideas of chivalry or paternalism, seem to be based on non-violence, but really involve some tolerance for violence. It's complicated. His third question was about. You got that? Yep.
Okay, I'll make it's the comment about the problems with the models developed in the English-speaking world. I think one of the characteristics of the descriptions of men in these, say, Duluth-inspired models is that they focus very much on explicitly patriarchal attitudes. And of course, if a man who is violent has adopted the language of gender equality and self-presentation of gender equality, it doesn't work. The exercises are wrong. You can't get at what actually is going on for him with those manuals developed necessarily. I mean, of course, they will fit somehow, but it is a misfit for some men. I think we need to be much more sensitive. And I'm thinking of... I'm also thinking about the violence in the way it's presented. It's linked to domination in a heterosexual relationship by men imposing themselves on women, very much. Whereas I think Swedish culture isn't very kind of imposing. It's much more consensus-oriented and withdrawn and silent compared to, I mean, on a European level, say, the UK, English, British cultures, perhaps. So perhaps to capture domination by withdrawal, by withdrawing yourself from emotional support, from emotional even response when somebody's trying to communicate with you. Those kinds of abusive behaviors, when combined with sexual violence and physical violence, etc., that hasn't been so elaborate, I think, in these models developed in the English-speaking world. Just to give you a few examples.
Mara had a series of, I think, very important questions about colonization, migration, and their relationship to violence against women. And it seems to me there are at least three ways in which colonization and migration might impact on violence against women. Certainly, they can break down the family and community structures that protect against violence against women, that with social disintegration and the sort of breakdown of traditional family and community structures, you can have an increase in domestic violence and sexual assault in the context of social and economic marginalisation.